Well, hi everybody. My name is John Szymankiewicz. Glad to be talking with you today. Hope you can hear me all right and so forth. I hadn't done one of these virtual things in a little while, but really appreciate craft beer professionals asking me to present today, and really appreciate White Labs sponsoring today as well. So I'm going to start off a little slow because we went live about 3 o'clock, but I realize it takes some folks some time to get in and logged on and onto the interwebs of the information superhighway or whatever the hell we're calling it these days. So I am going to kind of start a little bit slowly. We do have a comments and chat section. So if you have comments or questions, feel free to put them there. I'll try and answer those as we go along, and I'll also try and save some time towards the end of the presentation to answer any other follow-up questions as we go. So real quickly, what are we talking about today? I've done this presentation or a variation of it a couple of times now, and what I'm seeing as an alcohol attorney is, gosh, how do we, as breweries, wineries, distilleries, whatever your business is out there, how do we make other beverages? How do we grow our portfolio? How do we grow our brand? How do we grow our revenue, right? And so that's one of the things we're going to talk about today, because not all beverages are created equally. So I'm going to assume, for the purposes of this presentation, and we've got 45 minutes to talk about it, I'm going to assume for the purposes of this presentation that most of the folks on here are somehow tied to beer or breweries. I am sure that there are other folks out there who are doing things that are equally interesting, but not specifically beer, that may be joining us. I'm sure you can keep up, but that's how I'm going to frame my examples today. So I'm not going to, or rather I'm going to assume that you know how to do what you're currently doing. I'm not going to talk to you about how to label beer or how to do formulas for beer or any of that stuff. I'm going to focus on, gosh, if you're a brewery or you're a winery, what do you need to do something different, all right? To do a different beverage that hopefully can help you grow your business to that next level. Also, I will say, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, again, I am an attorney, and as an attorney, I typically get paid or sometimes get paid by the hour. And so as a result, I can talk forever about nothing. So I'm going to try and keep my focus pretty narrow here and get to the main topics. Got slides, a handout. And if anybody wants those, one, you can always email me, John, John, at beerlawcenter.com. Two, I'll also go ahead and post it on like the Facebook, CBP Facebook page, and anywhere else I can at that point. So don't feel like you got to write all this stuff down. You can always go get it later after we're done. All right. So based on all of that, let's go ahead and get started here. Let's see. Yep, there we go. So I am sharing my PowerPoint presentation that I will absolutely, again, post to everyone if they want it. And here's what to expect from today's talk. I'm going to start with about us, about me, a little bit about Beer Law Center, what we do. Then we're going to shift gears and talk about how things really work from a licensing standpoint, specifically the federal government. We'll touch on a couple of state issues, but for the most part, because we've got people all over the country and all over the world tuning in today, I'm not going to go into a lot of state-specific stuff, simply because it's all over the map. There's lots of different ways it's done, and I'm not going to tell you to do it one way because I'll probably be wrong. So then we're going to talk about alternating, specifically alternating proprietorships and alternating premises, and how those may be options for how you can grow your business or how you can meet the requirements to do whatever it is you want to do. We'll talk about labeling, and then move on to, okay, what about actually making the product? What are our sort of requirements around that? And then some what I call market considerations. And that's just some feedback I've gathered from clients over the last several years who have either started doing mead or started doing cider or started a winery, or in some cases a distillery, and some of the things, some of the challenges, some of the considerations that people have shared with me over that time frame to talk about, well, what does this mean for my existing business, and does it happen the way I thought it would? So that's what we're going to talk about today. We'll go ahead and jump over to me. Hey, again, my name is John Szymankiewicz. I'm an engineer by degree, and as a result, I early in my life got into home brewing. I've been a home brewer for over 20 years now. MBA at some point in the past and became a professional engineer, and then thought, the hell with this. I don't like what I'm doing, because I spent about 15 or so years in specialty chemicals and pharma, and I went back to law school. I went back to law school at night, and I will tell people, if you're ever thinking about doing that, it's a great experience, especially if you don't like your family. See, in 4 years. I went to school at night, worked during the day, had a teenage daughter at home. She didn't want to see me anyway, so it really kind of worked out fairly well. Anyway, so I've always been a beer geek, and when I went to law school, I decided I wanted to do something, one, that I was in a little more control of my own career than working at a pharmaceutical plant, and two, I wanted to do something I really enjoyed. And I was at the point in my life at the time that, gosh, shoveling out a hot, wet grain out of a mash tun at 5 a.m. probably isn't my idea of a good time anymore. So decided not to open a brewery, and instead thought, okay, I'm going to help people chase their dreams, right? So that's what I've done. Ever since I got out of school, this is kind of all I do. I started Beer Law Center, gosh, about 11 years ago now. And since then, working exclusively with breweries, wineries, distilleries, some alcohol retailers and sellers, and even a couple distributors. So we really at Beer Law Center focus strictly on the alcohol industry. We originally started out, like I said, just around craft beer, and have grown that now into breweries, wineries, and distilleries. And honestly, one of the challenges we've seen is around these alternative beverages. The regulations are just not made for the creativity that we find in the industry, right? So we'll share a little bit more about that, or I'll share more about that as we go on. Like I said, a little bit about Beer Law Center. We are a little bitty practice. This slide's a little bit out of date. When I said it was a niche practice, i.e. it was just me, and I answered the phone and I filed all the crap and so forth. Now we do have a paralegal, and I'm excited to say last fall, we got our first alcohol associate. A new attorney joined us, London Davenport, and she is quickly taking over probably 90% of our trademark work here at Beer Law Center. But anyway, we do alcohol law sort of cradle to grave, everything from startup of a business, corporate formation, licensing, federal and state, trademark, contracts, leases, even buying and selling alcohol producers or alcohol sellers. So we really consider ourselves business generalists with an alcohol overlay, right? So everything we do has some impact on the alcohol side. So hopefully we can bring a broad swath of insight to what you're doing. All right, so enough about me. That's enough of the commercial. Don't want to focus on that crap. That's not what you're here to hear. So I do want to kind of put this in perspective for us in terms of alternative beverages, I should say. This is a slide that I generated a little while ago, and at the time, I guess 2016 was the most recent numbers I had on here, and I'm not going to read the slide to you, but the bottom line here is that was the first time that we had more breweries than ever before in the country. And now we're up to about 8,000 open or in planning. COVID has taken a good swing at our industry, but it hasn't knocked us out. I am proud and pleased to say that even during COVID and the pandemic and everything we've seen over the last year, we're still seeing folks opening new breweries, new wineries, new distilleries. We've seen a rash of buying and selling. And so there are opportunities out there. If that's something that you're looking at, don't let that scare you away. What we've really seen, or what I've seen with clients, is that the pandemic has been a pressure test of the business model. If you can survive during this, if you can be nimble and shift up enough to, okay, we're limited on on-site sales, we need to move to distribution. If you have the ability to make those changes and react, and you can survive, if you can survive through the pandemic, you're golden. Everything else is going to be easy after this. All right. Okay, well, let's move on. Beer regulation overall. I want to talk real briefly about it. This is a stupid complex slide. And the whole idea here is, pre-prohibition, there wasn't a whole hell of a lot of regulation. Then leading up to prohibition, as states started to enact their own state-based prohibitions and restrict the sales or production of alcohol, things got weird. And then, of course, through the debacle that was prohibition, everything sucked for a while. After prohibition, though, we get the three-tier system. And what is the three-tier system? I think everybody else here knows it. Supplier, breweries, wineries, distilleries, a distributor that takes product from the supplier and gives it to the retailer, and the retailer is the one who sells it to consumers. Here's the regulatory piece. There's regulation of that stuff at the federal level for breweries or for suppliers and wholesalers. There is state level regulation for producers, wholesalers, and retailers. And then there is potentially local regulation as well, generally focused on the retailers. So you get multiple kinds of regulation and different levels of it, and it all impacts what you do and how you do it. We're going to focus today's discussion mostly on the federal side, and I'm going to give you a peek into some of the state stuff. But, I think this is not new news to anybody, so we'll keep moving on. So what is it that you're making, right? And that's the question I always want to ask clients, because largely, especially at the federal system, what you're making depends on how you make it, right? So you tell me, oh, I'm a brewery and I want to make cider. Whoa, time out. So federal folks see cider as a wine. So as a brewery, you cannot make a wine in your brewery. Right? Federal regulations say your product must be malt-based. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means most of the fermentables need to come from malt. Cider in and of itself, you don't have any malt or malt substitutes out there. So, that brings up the question, well, wait a minute, what about seltzer? That doesn't have any malt in it either. No, but the TTB has said, but we feel sugar is a substitute for malt. It's not a substitute for grapes. It's not a substitute for honey. It's not a substitute for apples, right? For some of these other things. So you're making a seltzer, you're going to be treated like a brewery. You're making a kombucha, that's really weird. And the federal folks, TTB, have kind of crammed kombucha down into the brewery bucket. So kombucha, you're still a brewery. Sati, chicha, some of these other things, you're still a brewery. And then you'll see on this slide, I've got this some RTD cocktails. RTD, of course, is ready to drink. So you can make some ready to drink cocktails as a brewery, but not all ready to drink cocktails. Wineries, you can always make wine, but cider, mead, and it doesn't matter whether it's sparkling mead or still mead, or whether it's sparkling cider or still cider, it's still wine, right? You got to be a winery to do that. Sake, wine coolers, and here's some other ones. Some liqueurs, some fortified wine, and some ready-to-drink cocktails. And then you got distilleries. Distilleries, obviously, you can make spirits. A brandy that's actually characterized somewhat differently than other spirits, but brandy's in that. And again, some liqueurs, some fortified wine, and some RTD cocktails. So what are these some stuff in here? Well, this is all about how it's made and the end ABV, right? So for example, as a brewery, you can make something that tastes like a Moscow Mule, right? And as long as it's based on malt, even if it's been filtered and filtered the hell out of it, and it could be damn near clear. If it's a malt with some sugar, and the ABV doesn't kick it into a special category that has to be sold through a ABC store, or doesn't make it a wine under some strange state regulations, then you can still make that as a brewery, right? You don't have to be something else. The same is true of a winery. Okay, you can make a cocktail that tastes like a pina colada, for example, but how you make it and that ABV makes a difference as to whether or not you could do that in a winery or if you need a separate license. So anything, for example, where you're going to add distilled spirits back to a product to get the ABV that you want, you're probably going to have to be a distillery, right? Because distilleries are the only ones, or generally speaking, the only ones who can add neutral spirits or can handle neutral spirits to other alcohols, right? Okay. So, oh, by the way, on the presentation of these slides, I've also got down at the bottom on several places on some of the slides, links to actual places, whether it's the TTB or other resources for more details on this. So what I want you to take away on this one is what it is you're making depends on how you make it, right? So we're going to step through with these basic theories of, you know, seltzer comes out of a brewery, cider and mead come out of a winery, and sort of distilled spirits come out of a distillery. Go figure. All right, moving on. But at the state level, and hopefully there's some Archer fans out here. I'm one of those. This is kind of a danger zone thing. But at the state level, how they characterize your product varies wildly. The same product in North Carolina may be considered a beer, and in Virginia might be considered a wine, right? So you have to be very, very careful about your state regulations on that product and dive into, okay, so I've got this thing, what's it going to be considered, right? And a lot of times, I'll be honest, sometimes the state doesn't know right away. When you say, hey, I'm making this sake, what would that be characterized for, you know, the Alcohol Beverage Commission for Idaho? And probably the first question out of their mouths is going to be, what's sake, right? So there may sometimes have to be some education with your state regulators if you're doing something really kind of different, right? Oh, got a good question up here in the comments. Thank you for asking. Where would non-alcohol fit in? Well, interestingly enough, you don't have to be you don't have to have any federal regulations or federal licensing at all to make a non-alcoholic beverage. The question then becomes, if you're making a non-alcoholic beverage, are you regulated under something else? Which, hint, you are. Are you regulated under the FDA because it's a food product? Are you regulated under a state department like the Department of Agriculture or something like that because you're producing a food product? So non-alcoholics, you're making a soda, you're making a tea of some sort or something like that, or flavored whatever, flavored water, seltzer, whatever you want to do. It's going to be a little bit different, but most of these regulations aren't going to apply. We're going to focus most of this conversation or this presentation just on the alcohol side. But thanks for asking the question. I'm going to try and catch those as we go along. Going back to how the state characterizes different products, there are lots of different ways to do that. Some of the more popular ones are those states that rely on that principal ingredient. Okay, if it's malt, it's a beer. If it's grapes or if it's a fruit, it's a wine. If it's just sugar, it's this, right? You know, those kind of principal ingredient questions. Some states tie in their alcohol percentage, right? Your ABV, so that, okay, it's a beer up until it gets to 12%, and anything over 12% is going to be in the wine category, right? So there's some states that work that way. There's some states that have a component of how the alcohol is achieved, right? So is this through pure fermentation? Is it through fermentation and then distillation? Are you getting a fermented product and then adding a neutral spirit back to it? That can also be, you know, kind of feed into how the state looks at these things. And then, of course, every state, not every state, lots of states are different on where's it going to be sold, right? So anything over X ABV has to go through a state store or a ABC or distilled spirit store, or anything under this number can be sold in the grocery stores. Those sort of things can be a factor as well. And then there's the challenge that sometimes the state stuff does not line up with the federal stuff. One of my examples here in North Carolina, we've got a winery permit called an unfortified winery permit, and then we've got fortified winery permits. So an unfortified winery permit is principally for a winery that achieves the alcohol strictly through natural fermentation. A fortified winery is a winery that ferments a wine and then adds alcohol to it to get a different ABV, right? So we're going to separate those two, but weirdly, there are little nuances that crop up. Like in North Carolina, an unfortified winery can add brandy to their wine to change the alcohol level, but only if the brandy was made from the same grapes as the underlying wine. So there are really kind of bizarre pieces out there that, like, okay, there's almost no way you would know that unless you specifically looked for that particular issue. So when you get to the state questions, contact a practitioner licensed to practice law in your state and dive into some of these things, because it can make a huge difference to your business plan as to whether it's feasible or not. All right. Let's talk about alternating. When we say, for example, I'm working with, I think, 3 or 4 different clients right now that are, hey, I'm a brewery, but I want to make something else. I want to make mead, or I want to make cider. And so they need to be licensed as a winery as well to be able to produce that other product. Here are 2 ways that can be done without having to build a whole new facility. I think most folks have heard about alternating proprietorships. Not as many folks are familiar with alternating premises. So an alternating proprietorship involves 2 companies, and they use the same equipment, and the equipment ownership alternates between the 2 according to an alternating agreement. You have to do some specific things on both companies' federal permits to make that happen, or to get that in place. But once it's in place, the federal folks will largely treat them as completely different businesses. They don't look at them at the same time, at the same way. They're as if they were completely different buildings, right? Each one is responsible for their own crap, and you better get it right. Alternating premises is a different concept. This is involving one company, and the 2 licenses actually alternate in the same space. So the same license, one of my clients is a brewery, and they're changing to an alternating premises for a brewery. And in the brewery, you're also going to have a winery, and the license or the permit is going to alternate within the premises between brewery and winery depending on the day. Sorry, I just saw the chat. I'll come back to that question here in a second. Thank you for it. But the alternating premises lets you, as one company in one space, hold 2 different licenses. That's cool. All right. So I gave you one example of an alternating premises and what you want to do with that if, say, I need to be a brewery today and a winery tomorrow. We can make that happen. The alternating proprietorship may still be an option for the same sort of thing if you're going to spin up a different country involving, a different company involving that other license. So, for example, let's say I'm Third Street Brewery, LLC, and I've got a brewery license. I'm going to change my federal permit to make it alternating, and I'm going to start up 3RD Winery, LLC, and that winery is going to be a separate company, and it's going to alternate in the same equipment, in the same space as my brewery. So there are reasons you might want to be an alternating proprietorship versus keeping everything under one roof for an alternating premises in the same company. A couple ideas there. So in the chat, I see Bell Brothers Brewing asked, are you aware of any interesting or rarely known requirements for a brewery brew pub license? Now that is interesting. So brew pubs are treated a little bit differently at the federal level. And, you know, my recommendation to most clients is that they almost never, or there's almost never a good reason to register at the federal level as a brewery, or excuse me, as a brew pub. As a brew pub, I always, not always, most of my clients that I've worked with, I advise them and we have registered them as a brewery that happens to have a restaurant attached to it, as opposed to a brew pub. One of the reasons for that is your state regulations, if they require that your federal and state permits match by class or by type, as a brew pub, some states limit what you can do for distribution, right? So for example, in North Carolina, where I am, if you're a brew pub, you cannot distribute off-site, right? As a brewery in North Carolina, you can self-distribute your product to yourself for your own tap room and to, you know, your local pizza place, but not if you're a brew pub. Now, thankfully in North Carolina, your federal and state licenses don't have to match up. But when you look at the regulations, the brew pubs have a different requirement for separation between the commercial and retail space than breweries do. So you're going to be held, if you're going to do an alternating agreement between, or an alternating premises or an alternating proprietorship between a brew pub and a brewery, both of them are going to be held to the higher standard of separation, which is probably the brewery side. So watch out for that if you're looking at that or looking to go into business with somebody else that has a brew pub and they, you know, you want to alternate with their a brewery within their brew pub. Okay, alternating. Oh yes, but at the state level, it's really frustrating sometimes because at the state level, some states don't allow alternating situations. And those that do allow alternating may not always allow both types. So this is something where, okay, even if the federal government says it's okay, your state may not quite be on board with it. So you do have to be careful about that. Okay, and a little side note, keep in mind, and I talked about this briefly, the different kinds of permits, especially at the federal level, may have different requirements for the facility. For example, distilleries, they focus differently on the bonded premises than you would for a brewery or a winery. And egress and ingress is a little bit different situation. And for example, as far as the federal government is concerned, there is no such thing as a retail outlet for a distillery. So whatever distillery, if you have a tasting room, the separation is much, much different than you would for a brewery with a tap room than a distillery with its own tasting room, okay? So keep that in mind. Look at the regulations there if you have questions. And if you look at the regulations, you're definitely going to have questions after that. So let's talk about labeling. And we're at about 3. I want to get through this, the next several slides here, not as quickly as we can, but in time to get through everything. Labeling. So again, I'm going to assume that most folks here are breweries. If you are looking at doing something else, I'm going to be a brewery and a distillery or a brewery and a winery, your labeling requirements are different. And sometimes within those labeling requirements, they're different depending on the product. So for example, wine, let's say you're a brewery and I want to make cider, I'm going to be a winery. Cider, you have different label requirements depending on the ABV and whether it's covered by TTB or FDA labeling. And there's a different tax rate depending on the ABV for cider. So be real careful and cognizant of that stuff. It's different, right? It's not hard, but it's different. And some of the things you think you know that you've been doing since time immemorial aren't going to work out the same. Look at the TTB website. I put a couple of links up there as well for the specific label requirements for wine and spirits. My biggest issue, with spirits labeling, one of the trickiest parts is the standards of identity, and that has to be right. And you know, some states, so this labeling is about the federal certificate of label approval. Some states require a certificate of label approval from the federal government for all products, no matter what. Some states, I'll go back to North Carolina, In North Carolina, as long as the product doesn't leave the state, you don't need a COLA, right? If it's completely within the state, you don't need a federal approval, but you still need state approval. But North Carolina, for distilled spirits, you need a certificate of label approval, even if it doesn't leave the state. So no matter what, you need a COLA. So be careful on that product, that those differences in products at your state. Make sure you're capturing the right things and doing the right things, because again, labeling can be different here too. At the state level, see, but I'm not even going to get into that. The good news is that some states, I won't say most, but many rely strictly on the federal COLA system for that. So there are states out there where you have to get a federal COLA, and the state says, if you got a federal COLA, you're good with us. There are other states that maintain their own systems, and you need to be really careful on those. Okay. All right. Let's do a time check and sort of a progress check here. We've talked about, well, we talked about me, go figure, surprise. We talked about the different classes of beverages, or kind of examples of classes of beverages, and what license lines up with them. We've talked about alternating proprietorships and alternating premises. We've talked about labeling. Oh, I said what BAM was. Oh, okay, BAM. Labeling, that stands for Beverage Alcohol Manual. There is a wine BAM and a spirits BAM and a beer BAM. And you know, go look at those things. It's just kind of a cutesy name. But if you haven't read the distilled spirits BAM, especially on the standards of identity, it will make your head spin. So that's a resource or several resources there. So let's actually talk about making the product, right? What do we need to worry about there? And we get to formulas. All right. So the general rule at the federal level is, so long as the beverage conforms to the normal characteristics generally attributable to blank, then a formula is not required. So is a formula required for a beer? Well, no, as long as it generally conforms to the normal characteristics generally attributed to beer. Stouts, IPAs, no, that's a beer. I don't need a formula for that because it's normal. But when we talk about normal characteristics, that also includes the ingredients. So if you're using ingredients that are not typically associated with beer, you need a formula, even if it looks, tastes, and feels like a beer. So this came to a head about 3 years ago. I think it was 3 years ago. And the TTB cracked down on a company in Florida. A brewery was making a hemp beer, and they did not get a formula approval. And the TTB said, wait a minute, hemp is not an approved ingredient. That is not a traditional ingredient in beer. You need a formula for that. And, you know, it was more of a slap on the wrist. I don't remember if there was any real violation or fines involved, but they used that to highlight, damn it, if it's something unusual, you need to get formula approval. So give you an example that makes a huge difference for folks in their business plan or how they go about doing things. If you're making a seltzer, technically that's a beer if you're using malt or sugar to do it, but that does not fit the normal characteristics generally attributed to beer. That means every product you make as a seltzer needs to have a formula approval. Okay, so that's another step you have to plan on to do, you know, in this process, especially if you're going to get cola, because that's when they're going to catch you in terms of you try and get a label approval, and they're going to say, okay, where's the formula approval for this? Well, I didn't have one. I didn't think I needed one. Well, bad news, you do. We're not just let you go back and get your formula first. So be aware of that. There are ingredients. If you're using, like I said here, the list of generally recognized as safe, the GRS list, even if you're using those, you may still need a formula approval. Hemp in any form needs a formula approval. If it's the TTB maintains a list of, hey, if you're using any of these fruits, we don't care if you don't need a formula approval. If you're using any of these vegetables, you don't need a formula approval. But if it's not on one of those couple of lists, you need formula approval. Let's see. Oh, and that's the next one, the beverage. The beverage itself, if it doesn't fit something, even if you're making it in that, you know, you're making a seltzer, you're making kombucha, especially the RTD cocktails. If you're making a Moscow Mule beer, basically, congratulations, you're going to need a formula for that, even if it looks like beer and tastes like beer, because one, well, it doesn't taste like beer. It's a Moscow Mule. It tastes like a Moscow Mule. It tastes like a cocktail. Therefore, you're going to need a formula approval for something like that. So keep that in mind as you look at all of this stuff. You need federal approval or federal formula stuff, even to stay in your existing wheelhouse, whether it's beer, wine, or distilled spirits, if you're doing something a little bit different. A little bit more on formulas. So the formulas of process and approval and the intricacies are one of the things I think that are most tricky for folks who don't do it a lot. And the TTB tries really hard to make this simple, and I won't say they fail miserably, but it's a very difficult thing to make very simple. But there's a bunch of resources on there, including at the TTB, here are the top 10 reasons for rejection of formula approvals. So check those out. Also, they have developed a tool. It's a interactive web tool where you click, am I a brewery? Am I a winery? Am I a distillery? Am I making this kind of product? Am I making this kind of product? And it actually walks you through with a series of yes or no or multiple choice questions and gives you an answer. No, you don't need a formula for this product. Or yes, you do need a formula for this product. So that's really helpful. So if you don't know, if you're not sure about it, check out that tool. It'll walk you through it and answer all those questions. Let's see. Okay, so now this market consideration stuff. And I'm going to talk a few minutes about this. And then I've got a few extra slides at the end. If we have time to get through them, great. If not, doesn't matter too much. But I do want to talk about these issues for your market. So as I've worked with clients that have expanded into other beverages, one of the main questions that comes up is, okay, how does this fit your brand, right? Are you doing this as a brand extension? Are you doing this just to have another offering in your tap room? The non-alcoholic question was a great one. Are you just going to make a root beer just so you have a non-alcoholic draft option on site? Or is this something that you're trying to build a separate identity off of? Is this something you're trying to grow the brand into something new, into something different? And what does that mean for you? So, for example, if I'm, I'll use Third Street Brewery, for example. If I'm Third Street Brewery and I've been making IPAs and, bourbon barrel aged stouts for the last 5 years, and next week I'm going to start kombuchery, well, how does that fit my brand? Am I going to draw in new people because of that brand, because of that other product? Are new people, or are my existing customers going to see me differently because of this new product? Are new customers going to see me differently because of that new product, especially if the name over the door hasn't changed? If, for example, you're trying to get new customers because you want to make seltzer and you want to get a new crowd in for seltzer, but it still says Third Street Brewery over the door. How does anybody know that I'm doing seltzer also, right? How am I going to get those other people into the tap room that wouldn't have come to me because they think of me as an IPA brewery, right? So next question there is, what do you do about that? So I'm working with a couple of different clients where maybe the answer here is we're going to create a separate brand for that other thing, right? For that other product. So it's going to be, Third Street Brewery, Third Street Brewery and 3RD cider, right? And we're going to change the image. We're going to change that somehow different. We're going to change the sign on the door. And are they going to be packaged differently? Or how are we going to do that? And one of the reasons that's going to be critical for you is if you are doing any distribution, you need to look real hard at what that brand means for any distribution agreements you have. So, good example. I have seen distribution agreements, and I started seeing this crop up in the last 2 years around me. A distribution agreement that says, well, normally a distribution agreement say, you know, we're going to distribute anything from any third brewery brand. Okay. On the other hand, I have now started seeing things say, we're going to distribute that anything that Third Street Brewery makes. And those are two different things, right? One would encompass, the latter would encompass any brand that I happen to make at my brewery, even if it doesn't say Third Street Brewery on it. The first one is only the ones that say Third Street Brewery on it. So that's going to make a big difference to, you know, is this something that, you know, my beer, I've already signed up with a distributor, so they're going to distribute that, but I can self-distribute my seltzer because it's a new brand. Does that matter to me, or what effect that's going to have? So there's a couple pieces that you really want to think about, more than just the brand identification, the brand story. You're also going to have some other legal implications there. One of the other things that I not always, but have often heard from clients is around the education piece. If you're going to do something like this, you have to educate your current customers. You know, I think we're seeing a lot less of the, oh, you know, they're making seltzer now too, they've sold out, like, you know, what you would have heard, you know, probably 3 or 4 years ago. I think we're seeing a more sophisticated customer that sort of understands the market probably than, again, maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So I think you're seeing that a little bit less. So a little less of a concern there. But you do want to make sure and educate your current consumers, and then figure out how you're going to educate new consumers. Are you only planning on educating the consumers who came into the brewery anyway, and you have to tell them about seltzer? Or are you talking about, hey, I have to go out and market for a different crowd than I've been marketing towards, right? Because maybe the seltzer drinkers are different, or you know, mead is going to be a different market than your standard craft beer person who's coming in for the latest, greatest juicy IPA, right? So you have to kind of think about that segmentation more than just, can I make the product? I've got a thing here on collaborations, partnerships, and joint ventures. Those are always possibilities for, you know, what you're going to do, and maybe you want to team up with a fellow brewery to make wine and then distribute it to yourselves in one or the other of your space. But when you do that, you also have to be very, very careful of 3-tier violations or tied house issues, especially where if you're in a state that doesn't, or that allows self-distribution. And certainly if you're in a state that allows a retail location, are you kind of crossing those lines because you're also a retailer and now you're getting product directly from another supplier? And is that a tied house issue if you have a joint ownership or a partnership with them? Okay. So those are the big things I wanted to hit. I'm gonna, it looks like we're at about 44 minutes right now. I'm probably gonna get cut off here in a little bit, but I do want to open up any questions. I haven't seen anything else come through. If anybody has any questions, let me know in short order, or forever hold your peace. In the meantime, as I'm waiting to see if anything comes through, I'm going to hit a couple of these other slides. Again, email me, john@beerlawcenter.com. Happy to send this to you. Also look at the CBP Facebook page. I'll post this stuff if anybody wants it there as well, especially for the links. Top permitting issues for the federal government. I always try and include this. This is this kind of stuff that gets people in trouble or causes problems. The biggest one is always documentation, clear, consistent, and detailed. Make sure pay your taxes. There's that tied house, prohibited ownership stuff again. Always watch for that. And remember, you are supposed to ask for approval, not for forgiveness. This is not an area where I would say it's easier to get forgiveness later. Other federal priorities in terms of enforcement, this is the stuff they're looking at. And notice that alternating premises or proprietorships is up there on the list. So if you're going down that road, make sure and get some advice, make sure you do things correctly, that you're having appropriate separation and following the schedules you laid out so you don't get in trouble, certainly with the feds, maybe with your state ABC or state regulators as well. What we see in state permitting issues, state compliance, almost always it's documentation. Sometimes you see these other things as well. The special events sometimes cause people are accidentally operate outside of their normal permit. Advertising. Always think about your advertising. Generally, there are things that suppliers can say that retailers can't, and vice versa. You may be able to do both because you've got a brewery with a tap room or something like that, or you may be prohibited from either one. Keep in mind, according to the federal government, social media is advertising. So be careful about what you say on social media and don't run afoul of some of the things. If you can't say it in print, you can't say it on social media either. Let's see. I think that's going to be about the last slide I have for today. It is me again, Beer Law Center at, I'm based in Raleigh, www.beerlawcenter.com. Twitter and Instagram, we're at Beer Law Center. Reach out to me via email, carrier pigeon, any of that stuff. Happy to chat if you have any questions. Or if you want any of the slides, again, I'll post that later. I think we have kind of flown through this stuff today. Sorry if I went a little too fast, but I'm, like I said, could talk forever about nothing. And so I have tend to try and go a little bit quickly to get everything in. I'm not sure if anybody else is still on, but I am going to go ahead and close us here pretty shortly. I haven't seen any additional questions. If I missed you, I'm sorry, let me know. And I will say one of the great parts about this virtual thing is I don't have to have the bottled water like I would at a normal conference. I'm drinking a nice local Pilsner while we're at it today. So really appreciate y'all tuning in today. Again, thanks to CBP for letting me do this today and for White Labs for sponsoring. Appreciate everything y'all do. Let me know if there's any way I can help, and have a great day. Cheers, y'all.